The climate crisis is a defining challenge of this century.
The United States steps back up to the podium it left empty for the last 4 years.
We have to mobilize in unprecedented ways to meet a challenge that is fast accelerating.
Robert Downey Jr. finds a new role as a green activist.
This really, for me, is the role of a lifetime, being a semi-retired superhero. This is real deal stuff.
Pipeline problems force a small community in Alberta to go soul searching.
It's empty. There's absolutely no one here.
And the attendees of the first digital Davos aim to ensure nobody is left behind.
If we are really going to be moving to a net zero carbon environment, all of society has to move.
This is also about driving growth and driving jobs forward.
In New York City, I'm Kaylee Lines, and this is Bloomberg Green. Iron Man is going green. The Footprint Coalition, which is founded by actor Robert Downey Jr. in 2019, is part VC, part nonprofit, part production house, and all centered around climate change. And it's more than just a whim. It's now his full-time job. This week, the Footprint Coalition announced it would inject funds into Insect. What's that? Well, it's among the world's biggest insect farms and now one of the best funded, with more than $372 million in Series C. Bugs are emerging as a high-protein, low-carbon alternative for, among other things, animal feed. Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordone spoke to Robert Downey Jr. about this new job as a climate investor and philanthropist and what he calls the role of a lifetime.
Robert, what solutions have you seen that you've been most excited about in the climate world?
I think it's so funny that the cloud paper, the bamboo toilet paper solution, I don't know why, but this was a year of toilet paper. So much discussion about it. So I think when things are topical, there's always an interest there. But to speak about Insect, sometimes what gets me thinking about how could I be additive is I know that if I go on, Stephen Colbert and I hold up a bag of this mealworm flour, it's just, there's an artifact to show. We're not talking about something because we want to talk about how Dudley Do-Right we are. This is something that's happening and it can happen at scale. Next step is I come talk to you in 6 months and we have a mealworm protein bar together. And we have a little taste test comparison. And all of a sudden, it's like we're normalizing these things.
You've said once, I'm a one-man carbon footprint nightmare colossus. Has your work over the past year and a half, really with Footprint Coalition, has this impacted the decisions you make in terms of your lifestyle at all?
I am in a shed between a shipping container and a chicken coop. And that's something I'd love to talk about later, just how we are trying to kind of demonstrate things you can do. In the last year, I said, how come all these fat cats have made billions of dollars while we've been struggling? There's this pandemic and there's this tsunami of, the environmental crisis coming down. Then I stopped and I said, wait a minute. When did I have my windfall? Right after the last economic downturn from 2008 till 2019. So it is that thing of you're pointing one finger and there's three pointing back at you. I think the realization of the future even of entertainment is a whole sector to become involved with. I mean, we burn a lot of, gas and other fuels and all that just so we can make entertainment. So,
well, is there a way Hollywood movies could be made more green? Like, could we have a greener version of Iron Man?
There certainly is. And I think a lot of it too is you just have to look at the infrastructure that's been there since the 30s, 40s, 50s, and then some innovation after mid-century to now. But it is something, it's not a dirty little secret, and every major studio and streamer wants to be net zero. But again, I think the coalition, part of our job and our skill set enables us to literally say, not only do we want to not just point wag a finger at you, we're going to come to you with 5 solutions that you could implement.
Yeah, Robert, you have over 48 million Instagram followers. You coming out and talking about climate could really push people, even just them wanting to be more educated about it. Do you hope other actors or other influencers will join you in this?
Anyone who's arriving now is late to the party. We know what this next 4-year horizon is going to be. We know that it is the thing. But you know, I wanted to go back to something that you'd asked before, because we all come up against bureaucratic inefficiencies. And really part of what sparked this was in some of my talks with the people who really could affect a fairly instantaneous change. They were zip-tied to dealing with the siloed mission statement of their mega corporation. And so that to me is something else that the coalition wants to address. Is that's all good and fine, we get it, but that is not the kind of conglomerate we need to bring to bear if we're really going to deal with this. It has to be more principally based on just like, how can we break down all of these turf wars that are going on, at least where we can.
If you were to join me again in 5 years' time, what would be something you'd hope you'd be able to accomplish?
I would say there'd been some policy that the fund had grown and was at numbers that'd be commensurate with what success would look like, that we had consumer-facing products, that these things had been done to scale, a nice percentage of them, and also that thing you can't know. Like, I love that part of, I don't know what it's going to be, but I know that we're going to do whatever it takes to get there. I think if I can look back and feel, I've been so activated. I mean, this really for me is the role of a lifetime, being a semi-retired superhero. This is real deal stuff, and it just lights up a different constellation in my psyche. And Mr. Schulhoff and Kropa and I, it's a really fun ride because the stakes are so high. You can't deny it.
Coming up, the defining challenge of the century, why the climate crisis will make or break the future of the global economy. We speak with the IMF's managing director, Kristalina Georgieva. This is Bloomberg Green.
It's a whole-of-government approach. Put climate change at the center of our domestic, national security, and foreign policy. It's advancing conservation, revitalizing communities in cities and on the farmlands, and securing environmental justice. Our plans are ambitious, but we are America.
We will see an ambition to invest in low-carbon, climate-resilient economy.
Given the science that climate change requires immediate action, this is the decade. And so we wanted to start by saying, look, let's make some good commitments.
All the companies that I interact with in the U.S. are very committed. They believe climate change is a real issue.
Climate change is not going to be fixed by a central bank.
We want to invest in clean technology.
We do need real breakthroughs.
That was the conversation on the Davos mountaintops in January of 2020. Climate change was beginning to steal the spotlight and increasingly becoming a priority in the world of business and policy. But then COVID intervened, dominating every part of human life. As society adjusts to a new normal, the urgency of climate change is going to the front burner.
I see a tremendous effort in terms of rallying now behind net zero, not only governments, but business.
This is about putting public money, but then also leveraging in many multiples in terms of private funding to get our economies going. And we've shown in the UK that green growth is possible.
Climate is our biggest threat. We'll get over this pandemic, we will resolve it. Climate is something where we will need to put the same efforts we used to fight the pandemic.
If we are really going to be moving to a net zero carbon environment, all of society has to move. Governments worldwide are going to need to invest in the R&D of how to prepare for climate change.
Climate change, if we do not tackle with it, could be the next big, let's say, virus with much more damaging and long-term consequences.
From Bloomberg's headquarters in New York, I'm Kaylee Lines. Well, at this year's digital Davos, climate change was once again the primary concern. But how much will it cost if the world doesn't act soon? This week's IMF World Economic Outlook projects growth to rebound in 2021. Advanced economies, though, will continue to feel the pain of the coronavirus crisis, while emerging economies will recover more quickly. But the organization insists that the long-term health of the global economy is dependent upon how green the coronavirus recovery is. We dig into the details with the managing director, Kristalina.
The climate crisis is a defining challenge of this century. Unmitigated, it would cost us somewhere between a couple of percentage points to a quarter of a global GDP disappearing if we don't act. And that makes it immediately a primary focus of the work of the IMF. There are three key priorities. One, to help our members integrate climate resilience and low carbon growth in their economic policies. Second, we are very concerned about risks to financial stability. We want to help with standards to integrate climate-related risks and to move towards stress testing for these risks. Last but not least, we want to generate better data for decision makers, a new dashboard that integrates climate indicators into macroeconomic indicators.
How do you convince economies that are just desperate to get back on track when it comes to growth to take on that short-term pain as they transform their economies to become greener?
The immediate objective for countries is to direct those of them that have fiscal space, some of it towards green investments to revitalize growth and revitalize job creation. When we did our research, we concluded that a green infrastructure investment push can add 0.7 percentage points to growth over the next 15 years. The job benefits of moving towards public investment and creating incentives for private investments for climate resilience, low carbon is incredibly positive.
Do you see any economic response that you think is sufficient right now?
Well, what we have seen in the beginning of the crisis, and rightly so, is concentration on measures to just protect the economy from collapse. In October, we took stock how much of the fiscal injection went green, and only a tiny fraction, about 2%. Since then, though, what we see is a number of countries, both advanced economies and some emerging markets like China, emphasizing stimulus in transformational terms. Where we are worried is countries that have very limited fiscal space, especially countries with high burden of debt. And there, it is so very important that we generate grants and concessional financing so they also have fiscal space to do what is right.
Some economists say you could have a win-win with these countries if you start financing the debt and you link it to climate goals. Do you think that's the right response?
For some countries that are in very deep debt distress, the right approach is debt restructuring, possibly debt relief. For many countries with significant debt levels where that is sustainable, debt for climate arrangements can be very beneficial for everybody. First, we can substitute expensive debt with cheap green debt, creating an instrument that allows these countries to access the enormity of liquidity that exists today. Second, there can be programs in which countries commit to transform their economies using a debt operation that converts their debt to domestic climate action commitment. Every single instrument at our disposal must be put to work.
Do you expect the United States to now lead the charge with this new administration that has climate change as a top priority?
It is very welcoming that the US has rejoined the Paris Agreement, not for the signature but for the action it would generate. It is also a chance for the big emitters to come together. Should they agree on a carbon price floor, that would give predictability to the world economy, and it would serve as a big accelerator of the transformation we have to undertake. If we all act in a determined manner, this transition is not only possible, but it is good for our societies, good for jobs. And having the US stepping up gives a much better chance for 21 to be a truly consequential year in this transformation.
What do you hope is the one thing these global economies could achieve in 2021?
The most important thing we can do today is to link the recovery from the pandemic to the transition to the new climate economy. It is once in a century crisis, but that makes it also once in a century opportunity. Utilizing this opportunity is going to be the task that we at the IMF will embrace and promote in our policy dialogue with our membership.
Coming up, the pipeline predicament. Just hours after assuming office, President Biden canceled the construction of the Keystone pipeline in Alberta. But where does that leave the community? This is Bloomberg Green. In New York, I'm Kaylee Lines, and this is Bloomberg Green. Now let's get your green brief. Here's Jennifer Zabazaja.
Here's the climate news you need to know this week. Failure is not an option at the COP26 summit later this year. That's the stark message of U.S. climate envoy John Kerry, who says it's the world's last chance to step up action on cutting carbon emissions. He's vowing the U.S. will make good on its promises and become a leader in the fight against global warming. Could President Biden declare a climate emergency? That's what the Senate's top Democrat Chuck Schumer is calling for. It's a controversial move, allowing the president to bypass Congress on certain issues and funnel money to clean energy projects. Everyone is fixated on the price of Bitcoin, but one thing they often don't think about is its impact on the environment. According to Digiconomist, the crypto's carbon footprint is about 37 million tons. That's about the same as New Zealand, a country of 5 million people. And Elon Musk is offering a $100 million prize for the best carbon capture technology. The world's richest man wants to find ways to lower the costs and use the emissions to make rocket fuel. Carbon capture can be used to trap greenhouse gases from plants and factories, or even directly from the air. I'm Jennifer Zabasaja in New York. Kaylee.
After 8 years of back and forth, President Biden canceled the Keystone XL oil pipeline project within hours of assuming office. The only problem, construction on the pipeline was already underway. Now the citizens of Oyen, Alberta have to make new plans for the community. Bloomberg's Robert Tuttle visited the small town to investigate.
It's empty. There's absolutely no one here. The Keystone XL pipeline is empty pipe just lying around here. I'm visiting you from Oyen, Alberta. And until a few days ago, this was kind of ground zero for construction of the Keystone XL pipeline. That all pretty much came to a halt a few days ago when Joe Biden, on his first day in office as U.S. president, signed an executive order that rescinded a permit that was given by the previous administration to build the pipeline.
Je pense qu'évidemment, il y a des gens, des travailleurs dans l'Ouest qui ont été très déçus par cette décision du président.
Fairly recently, as many as 1,000 people just staying here working on this oil pipeline.
I did not expect to see that in the first 100 days. I had a guy boarding with me, and he comes in at 10 o'clock, and he says, hey, I'm done. He left. I think there's still 300 guys left. You know, they didn't all just exit town just like that. You know, they can't leave the pipe exposed, so they got to close that up. They'll be done here in a month.
People are still holding on to the hope that the project isn't dead.
You're still kind of hopeful that maybe this project can be revived, do you think?
Yeah, we're waiting for news from TransCanada, and we'll just go forward until we hear those news.
But it's clear that many of the workforce here are getting ready to leave or have left. Keystone XL was a very controversial pipeline. It was going to be built to carry as much as 800,000 barrels a day of oil sands crude from Alberta down into the United States. Its critics claim that it would contribute to global warming by fostering development of the oil sands. But the oil industry here said that they needed that pipeline to deliver their oil to market. This town is kind of in waiting to see what happens.
Mais il faut se souvenir que le fait d'avoir un président qui est beaucoup plus aligné, pas seulement avec mes valeurs en tant que Premier ministre, mais avec les valeurs des Canadiens par rapport à la lutte contre les changements climatiques, par rapport à la nécessité de bâtir une économie qui travaille pour tout le monde, avec des bons emplois pour tout le monde.
For more on this, let's bring in our resident green expert, Akshat Rati. Akshat, the cancellation of this project led to job losses. That doesn't help the economic recovery that we need. Could you put that into context for us?
That's certainly right. We know that TC Energy has laid out about 1,000 jobs connected to the project. And in this environment, any job losses aren't welcome. But there's a bigger story here. And the environmentalists argue that it's not just about one pipeline. The goal is to try and wean the entire society of fossil fuels. So yes, in any transition, you will have some job losses, but what's coming in the form of green energy and what could be a green recovery will create many times more jobs and put out fewer emissions.
Why is it fossil fuel pipelines that have become such a hot button issue? What do they mean specifically for climate change?
Yeah, it's a funny one. Pipelines in themselves don't produce any emissions. It's really the stuff that is carried in them, either oil or gas, that will end up producing emissions. But because governments have not been acting as urgently as the science asks that they act, it's left environmentalists with very few options. So the ideal outcome would be governments put a carbon tax and society adjusts to this new normal. That's not happening. And so what they do is they try and essentially pinch at the points that they can. And pipelines are one that you can have a plan on because they go through other people's lands and you can make a case for why that is not something that you would like society to have.
So pipeline's part of the plan, but obviously President Biden has a broader climate agenda. How is the oil industry going to need to adapt to that? What do they have to do?
It's going to be a time of disruption because the oil and gas industry now with Biden in the White House has been given a very clear signal that climate change is something that this administration is going to take very seriously. And not just the pipeline, we understood this week that the Biden administration is canceling oil and gas leases on federal lands, which is a huge swath of the country. And so what the oil industry really needs to do now is to absorb the fact that the energy transition is here, that we need to be able to find ourselves using fewer and fewer fossil fuels in the future. And it would be helpful if the oil and gas industry takes this as an opportunity and figures out what types of clean energy it can provide.
All right, the energy transition is here. Thank you so much to Bloomberg's Akshat Rati. That's all for this week, but you can keep the conversation going. Follow us on Twitter @Climate. I'm Kaylee Lines in New York, and this is Bloomberg Green.